All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and the draft is over. And today you'll be getting my comprehensive overall thoughts on this Falcons 2022 draft class.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong, however, on Twitter at FalcFans, and of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline is where the game starts. So, guys, I want to thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. And of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and of course on YouTube. And you can get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio version drops in the morning. And guys, today's episode, for those of you that most of you are probably listening to this on Monday, some of you are watching this on Sunday. And this is for those folks that may have not listened to the last 3 days of episodes where I sort of recapped each day of the draft to get my sort of thoughts on each individual pick and whatnot. But we'll just sort of give you an overview of this entire draft class, starting with the players that I feel really good about are going to turn into good pros for the Falcons, the players or player that, is a little bit more of a question mark, and then the players that are even bigger question marks and probably don't necessarily have the high end upside that some of these other guys have. So that first group, that's Drake London, Arnold Ebbachty are the players that I feel really good about turning into good pros. I think both players have relatively high ceilings. It's just a question of whether or not those guys will ultimately develop them and reach those ceilings here in Atlanta. And obviously, should those players reach their ceilings, that will play a huge part in the Falcons' team success moving forward. And, when it comes to like Drake London comparisons, you'll hear a lot of people say Mike Evans. I'm not there with that. I think I've heard other people use the Michael Thomas comp. And I think that probably is a better comparison to what Drake London is going to be. That's probably his ceiling in terms of the potential to be a top 10 wide receiver like Michael Thomas. I think probably a more realistic, if we're talking like eye level, Kenny Galladay, Allen Robinson's probably another good comparison for what Drake London. And I think London has a little bit more fluidity to his game like Robinson than necessarily Galladay. And we're referring to Detroit Galladay, not New York Galladay, because people forget that, Kenny Galladay really excelled in contested catches in 2019 and 2020. I think he actually led the league in contested catches in 2019. I think he had the highest percentage of contested catches caught in 2020. So I think that's kind of what you're hoping for with Drake London. And those are obviously three wide receivers that, at least when we count Galladay in Detroit and Robinson most years, and Thomas, obviously 1,000-yard types of receivers that can consistently give you that year in and year out. And so I think with London, it's going to be interesting to see where he is a year or two from now. Once the Falcons can get more of the pieces that they need on offense around him to see what he can do to unlock that full potential. It'll be interesting to see what kinds of things the Falcons can cook up this year under Arthur Smith with him and Kyle Pitts, particularly when they deploy their 3x1 sets and use one of those guys, as that singled up receiver on one side of the field and sort of be in those one-on-one situations where they can use their height and their size to an advantage over cornerbacks or whatever the case may be. But for me, when I look at this Falcons offense, obviously they have question marks at the quarterback and offensive line and in the running game. But when we look at this wide receiver core, I think ultimately the thing that's really missing from this group is a speed threat, a real vertical threat that can take the top off this defense. And that kind of goes to the conversation I was having on yesterday's episode, where my one knock on this draft class is that you're drafting a bunch of players that are similar to players that you already have. And that's kind of true with Drake London, where, he's the same type of player that Alden Tate is. Again, he's much better than Alden Tate. Don't get me wrong. But you already have like big contested catch guys like Auden Tate and Kyle Pitts on the roster. And when people say that you want to build your wide receiver core like a basketball lineup, London, Tate, and Pitts represent a really good front court, but you don't really have a back court. And that's where the speed threat comes in. But that will be obviously something that the Falcons will have to, worry about next year. So we'll just sort of see how London and the rest of the front court, can handle those low post assignments and whatnot. But let's move on to Arnold Ebbachty, the other of the Falcons draft picks that I do feel really good about. And now that I've sat down and watched a little bit more of his film, he's primarily a speed rusher. He does have a power element to his game. It's not really refined at this point in time. And I think it would enhance his ability to utilize more power in his game if he was to bulk up. Something in this 260-pound range, I think, would be ideal for him. I know he was 247 at his pro day, was 250 at the Senior Bowl, and 250 at the Combine. So I feel like another 8 to 10 pounds of muscle would do wonders for him. But I think the thing that stands out about Ebiketie, in addition to his first step quickness, is his hand usage. He hasn't quite mastered it. He's not a true technician. But once he's able to refine his hand usage and really manipulate tackles better, using those swipes and side scissors and timing those rushers and timing his hands to what the tackles are doing and counting what the tackles are doing. I think he'll be a really effective pass rusher and has that potential to be potentially a double-digit sack guy, particularly if he can, also add that power element to his game. And so we'll just see, like it is the case with all pass rushers, it's a matter of development. But I have no reason at this point in time to doubt that he can't get there. So we'll just see how that goes. And then when you look at his testing numbers, they're very good, the explosiveness and whatnot. And looking at, the list of first round edges that I have, kept track of since, combine time over the last 12 years, athletically, there isn't a real obvious comparison for him that's like, oh, he's exactly this type of athlete. But probably the closest athlete he is to, in terms of his size and his length and his explosiveness and his bend and all these various things, is probably Brian Burns, based off of the guys that were drafted in round 1. Now, there's probably a couple of round 2 edges that if I did the research, I could probably find. Like, I know Harold Landry's pretty close comparably from an athletic standpoint as well, and he was a second round pick. But yeah, I feel like, their games in terms of Ebiketie and Burns' games, they're similar. Like, I think Burns was a much better player coming out of Florida State than Ebiketie was, but they are kind of similar styles of players, and I could see a similar sort of trajectory in the NFL if Ebiketie can develop. So similarly to London, I think you're hoping for a big year 1 to year 2 jump for Ebiketie. And that will be a huge part of whether or not this Falcon team is going to make that big leap that, I know a lot of fans are hoping and wanting them to make come 2023 moving forward. So, obviously Ebiketie single-handedly is not going to give the Falcons a good pass rush. They're still probably going to be, hopefully we can be bottom 5 instead of bottom 1 this year. But, he's definitely a step in the right direction. And we'll see if, Desmond Ritter is a step in the right direction when it comes to the quarterback position. He's the player that I have more question marks about, but it's less about the player and it's more about the environment when it comes to developing quarterbacks. And we'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast, guys. But before we get there, I do want to plug the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, where you can find 3 different shows with 3 different personalities and 3 different distinct takes, or really 4 different distinct takes on Atlanta and Georgia sports. You got A to Z with Mark Zeno, you got Hitting Hard with John Chuckery, and you got ATL Day Ones with Tanitra Batiste and Jarvis Davis. They're all giving you their thoughts on all things Falcons, Braves, Hawks, Bulldogs, Georgia Tech, Atlanta United, etc., as well as national sports headlines. So check out all 3 shows or find your favorite one on the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast feed, free and available on all the same podcast platforms you find Locked On Falcons, as well as on YouTube. And guys, now that the draft is over and draft props are done, and maybe you were like me and you came out ahead on some of the draft props you had, but you're still in the groove, and you want to head on over to the number one source for all your sports betting needs and info. And of course, I'm talking about betonline.net. You can find podcasts, the latest odds, contests, and player props, you name it. BetOnline has it all, and it's not just draft props or baseball or NBA playoffs. You can find NHL, hockey playoffs, UFC, golf, boxing, esports, your favorite Vegas casino games, whatever you need. BetOnline has it all. And if you're feeling particularly frisky now that you're looking at the Falcons draft haul and you're saying, hey man, this is a great draft haul, and you're looking at the win totals, which you can bet on at betonline.net. The Falcons have the second lowest win total of any team in the NFL, behind the Houston Texans with 4.5 wins and over under of 4.5 wins. So if you're feeling like, hey man, I think this Falcons draft class has really moved the needle forward for me to take the over, but then betonline.net is the place to go to take advantage of it. Or if you probably like me, being like, I'm still going to take the under on that 4.5 win total, based off of this draft class. Well, BetOnline again is the place to go. BetOnline, where the game starts. So we're finished talking about the guys that I feel most good about in this draft class. Let's talk about the guy that's at least the next most worthy of being hyped up, right? We got to hype up these guys post draft. And that to me is Desmond Ritter is the guy that's most worthy and most intriguing, and probably the guy that we'll spend probably the most amount of time over the next probably 3 months talking about, if we're being honest. If sitting here today, he's the most compelling of the Falcons 8 draft picks, right? And I think when we can look back on this draft and say, hey, it was one of the better draft classes that we've had in recent Falcons history, and by recent I mean like 20-25 years. It's likely going to be because Desmond Ritter doesn't turn into like a top 15 quarterback that a lot of people think he has the potential to be. And like I've said before, when I watched Ritter earlier this offseason, I wasn't quite convinced that he was going to be that guy. I saw the potential, but I didn't come away watching, the television copy rather than the all 22, because I didn't have access to the all 22. Hopefully I'll get some in the coming weeks. But like, I didn't come away thinking, oh yeah, this guy's definitely going to be a top 10, top 15-ish type of quarterback that some people seem to think he is. And again, some of that is owed to watching on television, because it's harder to see him go through those progressions that you want to see him go, which is the main reason why most of the people, from what I've heard and read and listened to, most of the people that were high on Ritter as their QB1 were high on him because of his ability to read and go through progressions, and making him one of the more, if not the most pro ready of the quarterbacks in this draft class, to operate a pro style offense. And I know Cincinnati ran a lot of similar concepts to what the Falcons ran in under Arthur Smith this past year. And so, it's going to be interesting to see what will happen with him this year, because he is going to play. I've been saying it for 6 weeks, basically since the Falcons traded Matt Ryan and brought in Marcus Mariota, that, while Marcus Mariota may start the season as a starter, he's very unlikely to finish the season as a starter. And that's not just simply due, he has a history of getting injured. It's just the nature of the NFL that when you have a bridge quarterback like Marcus Mariota is on a non-playoff team, they very rarely start and finish seasons. And when you look back at NFL history, you just got to look at this and the reasons why quarterbacks like Patrick Mahomes and Aaron Rodgers and Trey Lance sat for an entire year versus starting as rookies was because they were playing behind veteran quarterbacks on playoff teams. Those Chiefs, those Packers, and those 49ers teams had Super Bowl aspirations. So they were willing to stick it out with Alex Smith and Brett Favre and Jimmy Garoppolo. In several of those cases, they were, justified in doing that. But whether we're talking about first round guys or later round guys, whether it's, Davis Mills or Jalen Hurts or Gardner Minshew or Drew Lock, you don't have to be a first round pick to see the pattern that repeats itself, that if you're, not competitive and winning games with Marcus Mariota, that, a guy like Desmond Ritter is definitely going to get put out there at some point. It's just a matter of when, not if. And, I think the truth is that the Falcons should be willing to put Desmond Ritter out there. I don't think they need to rush him into the lineup or whatever the case may be if he's not ready or before he's ready. but eventually, this is the end goal of the Falcons, is to get Desmond ready enough to play at some point this season, because you want to see what you have in him before the season is done, so that going into next offseason whether or not you need to go out there and get a quarterback, particularly if you're going to have a high pick. And, as I mentioned on the betonline.net read, the Falcons win total is going to be very low. And again, despite, the high feelings and the buzz generating from this draft class, I got to be that guy to pee in the punch bowl. And I'm sorry, get out of line. But, I don't think the Falcons have changed the math to be anything more than, I thought they were a 3-5 win team a week ago. I think they're still likely to be a 3-5 win team today. So you're not really expecting Ritter to be the savior, particularly given that type of supporting cast, that type of environment that he's coming into in Atlanta. And, let's be real, playing behind what is likely to be this offensive line without significant improvement, and what's going to be not necessarily a good running team, again, without significant improvement there, that's not an environment that's conducive to success. But the hope is that if and when Ritter gets an opportunity to play this year, you're hoping to see flashes. This is similar to what the Texans had with Davis Mills, right? Now, the difference is the Texans knew going into this year's draft class that it wasn't likely that, any of these quarterbacks was going to be a slam dunk home run upgrade over Davis Mills. The expectation for the 2023 quarterback class is that there's at least two guys, and we'll see if that holds true, 9 months from now. But, there's a couple of guys that are definitely potentially slam dunk upgrades over Davis Mills. So the Texans were willing to basically give Davis Mills another year to figure it out. Same thing with Jalen Hurts in Philadelphia, not to mention, the fact that the Eagles were actually a playoff team this past year. But it's a similar conversation with the Falcons and Desmond Ritter. Are you going to sit here potentially with a top 3-5 pick and look at a guy like CJ Stroud or Bryce Young and say that guy is definitely better than what we have with Desmond Ritter? And the only way you're going to know that is by getting Desmond Ritter on the field at some point in time. So, again, it's no disrespect to Marcus Mariota. I know some of you guys take it as that, particularly in the comments here on YouTube, but it's just the nature of the beast. That's part of the reason. And I said this on, I think, the first episode we talked about Marcus Mariota. I said he's going to be the least talked about starting quarterback ever, at least as far as my perspective is, because I just know he's just the bridge, and we're just biding our time until the next guy comes in. And that's clearly now Desmond Ritter, right? The only difference, if they hadn't taken Ritter, was, whether we'd be just spending all fall, instead of talking about Desmond Ritter, we'd be spending all fall talking about CJ Stroud or Bryce Young. Yeah, that's the only thing that's changed, right? It's just now it's Desmond Ritter, and then, hey, what about CJ Stroud? But a lot of that will depend on sort of how Ritter performs, and we'll just sort of have to see how it works out. And obviously, I think we'll be much more excited about Ritter's potential, when he gets that one series in the preseason, that only series of action that he'll get, and he'll go 3 for 3 for 45 yards, and we'll all be jacked up and ready to go, and crowning him as, the next franchise quarterback here in Atlanta. So we'll be a lot more optimistic about his future after that one drive in the preseason, where he connects, 3 passes, 2 to Drake London and 1 to Kyle Pitts. So that will be something to look forward to in that one game of preseason action that he gets this year. So yes, and no, I will not let it go, guys. This is going to be we're going to run that joke into the ground by the time we get to August. But with that being said, we won't be running in this draft analysis into the ground, because we still got a couple more players to talk about. I want to talk about Troy Andersen and DeAngelo Malone, 2 guys that when we talked about them on the day 2 recap, I didn't really have that many thoughts to say about them, because I hadn't really watched any of their games. Now that I have some thoughts on them, as well as, a couple of follow-up thoughts on the day 3 guys. And we'll, wrap up today's Locked On Falcons draft recap by talking about those guys coming up. But before we get there, guys, I do want to thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen. And as usual, I have recommendations for what your second listen should be. Why not check out the Locked On NFL or Locked On NFL Draft podcast, 2 shows that will be covering, all the teams around the league, who won the draft, who lost the draft, etc., who are the steals, who are the hits, who are the misses, all those various things. And you can find Locked On NFL and Locked On NFL Draft free and available on all the same podcast platforms you listen to Locked On Falcons, as well as watch on YouTube. And guys, now that the draft is over, this is going to be a dark time for football information, but that doesn't mean it can be a dark time for you, and particularly when it comes to your diet, because now is a great time to get in the gym, working out, working towards that beach body, that summer body, and of course, you're going to need the fuel to work towards that. And of course, Built Bar is the thing to be the perfect fuel for you, because it's the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar, even better than a candy bar, because Built Bars not only taste good, they're good for you. They're low in sugar, low in calories, low in carbs, high in protein, high in fiber. They unveiled their granola flavor. You got chocolate peanut butter, chocolate coconut. Their white chocolate berry sold out. So these things are hot, 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 just like the summer. So go to built.com, try out one of their new granola flavors. You can get a mixed box of the granola flavors. You can get a mixed box of their puffs. You can get a mixed box of their tried and true flavors. The puffs are their first protein infused marshmallow. So head on over to built.com right now and use the promo code LOCKED15 when you get there, and you'll get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKED15, LOCKED15, for 15% off at built.com. So, we'll spend the bulk of the remainder of today's episode talking about Troy Andersen and DeAngelo Malone. And that's no offense to the day 3 guys, but I don't have much else to say about those guys that I didn't say on yesterday's episode, or, Sunday's episode. If, I don't know, the timeline's all screwed up. But, I think all those day 3 guys, for the most part, if for those of you that didn't catch that episode, the clip notes or spark notes, and depending on, if you're a millennial or Gen Z, I don't know what they're called now. But they're all role players, right? I think Tyler Algier has the potential to be a solid RB2 in the NFL. I don't know if he's going to be a lot more than that. I think Justin Schaefer is probably a career backup in the NFL. And even in a world where he does beat out Jalen Mayfield for the starting job this year, which I think is unlikely, he's probably still going to be one of the worst guards in the NFL, if I'm being completely honest with you. Like, your best case scenario is going from the 64th best guard in the NFL to the 57th best guard in the NFL, and of course Fitzpatrick's a blocking tight end that's probably going to spend the bulk of his early career playing special teams, similar to what we saw with Eric Saubert. So, I think when we look at this draft class, in addition to Desmond Ritter being that X factor to see if he turns into a high level quarterback in the future, I think Troy Andersen and DeAngelo Malone are also X factors. Now that I've watched them a little bit more, I think they're both intriguing talents, but I think they have a lot of development to do before they're really ready to be regular contributors on the football field. I think unlike London and Ebiketie, who have relatively high floors that I think can come into the NFL early, this year and contribute as, may not be high level starters, but like competent starters in the league right away. I don't think that's the case with Andersen and Malone. I think both of those guys are more developmental guys. When with Andersen, the word on him, I think is correct. He's kind of this athletic, rangy linebacker, has a lot of coverage potential, but that's the pros. The cons are, he's not particularly physical and, doesn't make too many plays, not too instinctual between the numbers. And basically, and this goes back to again the conversation I've had about having similar players. He's kind of like a 6'4" version of Dion Jones, right? Like, I think he can get better at those things than he currently is, but like Dion Jones, like that's not really the strength of his game. So I think you can say, okay, he's a better version of Dion Jones because maybe he can cover tight ends better because of that size and length that he has than Dion Jones particularly does. Dion Jones always specialized in covering running backs. But as of right now, he's not necessarily a massive upgrade over what Dion, or at least certainly right now, he's not an upgrade over Dion Jones. In terms of what he can be, I don't know if he's going to be a massive upgrade over what Dion Jones was before. Maybe what Dion Jones was last year, sure, because that was the worst season Dion Jones has played. But, in terms of where Dion Jones was 2-3 years ago, I don't know if Troy Andersen's going to be better than that. But again, that was a really good player. So if he only hits that benchmark, I don't think that's a negative when it comes to this. I know there's been a lot of speculation since Andersen's selection that Dion Jones is now a goner. I'm not convinced of that. It's certainly possible that the Falcons could decide to move on from Dion Jones in a post June 1 trade to free up, roughly $15 million in cap space. But you would have to get someone to take him on. And right now, there's just not that many teams right now that realistically could absorb Dion Jones's contract in a post June 1 trade. that are also in the market for a starting linebacker in all likelihood, but we'll see how that develops. I think, you can make the case that there were better linebackers on the board when the Falcons picked Andersen. I think the most interesting tidbit about the reason why the Falcons picked Andersen is the coaching connection that he has with the Falcons' current running backs coach. Michael Petrie was the running back coach at Montana State when Troy Andersen was a freshman playing running back for that team. And so it's similar to the dynamic you saw last year with Darren Hall being a fourth round pick, where a lot of people were like, this guy's, this is a reach in the draft or whatever the case may be. He's getting picked a couple of rounds too early, but that was because the coaching connection between John Hoke, the secondary coach, and his brother Brady Hoke, who was a coach at San Diego State, and his son, I think, was also the DB's coach at San Diego State. And so, I wouldn't say Troy Andersen was a reach or anything like that. Maybe you can make the argument he should have been a third round pick instead of a second round pick, but I think you can certainly make the case, and I will not argue against the idea that there were better linebackers on the board when the Falcons picked Troy Andersen. And certainly in a world where I think the Falcons were looking to move on from Debo immediately and needed someone who could come in and play right away, I think you can make the case that there were better options available for the Falcons. But that's part of the reason why I'm hesitant to buy that the Falcons are looking to move on from Debo immediately, just because I don't think Troy Andersen's really that ready to play. I think he's probably going to start out on special teams. He can be in the mix and be in the rotation. We did see the team use 3 inside linebackers last year, with Michael Walker being deployed in coverage situations quite a bit last year. And so you could do some of that stuff with Troy Andersen. But in more likelihood, I think, the Falcons are betting on the long-term development where Troy Andersen's going to be 2-3 years from now, as opposed to what he's expected to do right now. And so, they believe in the player because they have a connection to that player. They have a coach on staff that knows the player from when he was, 18 years old and whatever the case may be. And, they believe that they can develop that potential in him. And, I'm not going to sit here and doubt them. I guess they deserve the benefit of the doubt in that regard because they know the player better than I do. So we'll see how that plays out with DeAngelo Malone. He's technically another pass rusher, but I wasn't particularly impressed with him as a pass rusher from the games I watched. And I said this on Twitter. He reminded me a lot of Michael Walker because I remember when Walker was at Fresno State early in his career, he was primarily a pass rusher, but his skill set didn't really translate to being an effective pass rusher in the NFL, and that's why the Falcons moved into more of an off-ball linebacker. He did move to off-ball linebacker officially in his last 2 years at Fresno State as well. And I think Malone is probably destined to be a better pass rusher than Michael Walker was at the NFL level. But I don't necessarily foresee him being a regular in the Falcons 4-man rushes, right? Like, I don't see him turning into that type of guy that you're going to trust is going to get 30, 40 or more pressures every single year, 5 or more sacks every single year. I won't sit here and say he can't do those things, but I think he's probably more destined to that Sam linebacker role than that Jack linebacker role in the Falcons, 3-4, esque scheme. And that's more of the guy that's defending the run, dropping into coverage, than a guy that's a true designated pin his ears back and get after the quarterback every single snap and whatnot. And, I think similar to Ebiketie, he's going to have to bulk up some. He's just kind of undersized, and he plays undersized. And to really have a chance, it's just too often, I think he's just going to get easily controlled by NFL caliber offensive tackles because he's getting controlled by NFL, not NFL caliber offensive tackles, in the Sun Belt or the Conference USA or wherever the heck Western Kentucky plays. And I think similar to Andersen, he's probably going to be more of a special teams player early in his career, at least this year. And then we're just kind of hoping that he can make that year or two jump in 2023, potentially where a guy like Lorenzo Carter is off the team. Dion Jones is off the team. Both of these guys are guys that you would hope can slot into those starting spots and can flash enough, this summer and this season, should they get opportunities on defense, in addition to whatever they contribute on special teams, that you can feel good about them being ready to take over next year. So that's the hope. And I think ultimately, when we look at this collection of talent that the Falcons have assembled from this draft class, I think it can be one of the better ones if these guys are developed, right? And I think that's really a good litmus test to sort of see if this team is trending in the right direction. Um, Not only from what the 2022 players are going to be like when they make the year one or year two jump, but you also want to see some of these 2020 and 2021 guys make that jump, right? Like we haven't gotten reliable contributions from guys in that 2020 class like Marlon Davidson and Matt Hennessy, Michael Walker, and Jalen Hawkins. You had the 2021 class, and you're looking for big jumps for guys like, Richie Grant, Jalen Mayfield, as well as Darren Hall, Drew Dahlman, Taquan Graham, Adeola Ogundeji, Frank Darby. Avery Williams is fine. I'm not listing him on that group because I'm expecting him to continue to light it up on special teams, not necessarily on defense. And so obviously you don't need all of those guys to step up from that 2020 and 2021 group. But ideally, out of the, I think 11 guys I named, you can get 3 or 4 competent starters out of that group. You can get 3 or 4 quality backups out of that group. So, 7 or 8 out of 11 turn into viable contributors that you can trust, that can do their jobs each and every Sunday. And if you can see that emerge this year from those 2 draft classes, I think it will give you confidence moving forward for the 2022 draft class, that when the time comes for those guys to make their leaps, that this coaching staff will be able to get that out of them at the time when it matters. So that's my general thoughts on this draft class, guys. Tomorrow, I think we'll have a guest. I think Trevor Sikkema is scheduled, if I got to check my calendar. But I think Trevor Sikkema of Pro Football Focus will be joining me tomorrow to talk his thoughts on the Falcons draft class. We have a whole lot of guests that will be coming in the coming days and weeks to give their thoughts on these players, and probably a lot more positive takes on the Falcons draft class than I did. As we, it just buys me time to do the film study so that I can drop those scouting reports later this month, and those comprehensive breakdowns of each and every one of these players. But that's the general overview for me, and we can haggle about the details and whatnot with player comps and floors and ceilings and all that stuff as the rest of the summer unfolds. So guys, I appreciate you tuning in for another episode. I believe we still got 5 more days. 5. Sorry, I can't do math. No, I don't know, man. 4 more days of draft miss, of straight draft content and consecutive days. I'm rambling now. I'll just stop talking. Guys, if you want to hit me up, you can provide your feedback via Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons, via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. I appreciate you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. And of course, always recommend checking out Locked On Braves, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Sports Atlanta for your second listens each and every day. Of course, Locked On NFL, Locked On NFL Draft have you covered as well. So appreciate you guys. Till then.